Slack or anything like that, but I want to spend a chunk of time today talking about baseball weather concerns because it comes up all the time. It's something that is core to MLB DFS, and I want to really start from the beginning with that conversation while we have the time to go over it. So what I am going to do here is pull up my screen. If at any point as well, I'm going to get my screen up here. If you are having a hard time hearing me or seeing my screen, also let me know. I know that has come up a couple times here where I am just chatting and going on a bit of a tangent, and I somehow either change the volume on my headset or something like that, and all of a sudden people can't hear me. So, or vice versa, screen wasn't sharing when I thought it was. I've gotten a little bit better as I've gotten used to hosting these. But of course, the most important thing is that you guys can see and hear what is going on. So if you can't, it is good to let me know. But where I'm going to start with our baseball weather discussion here is actually on the rules for the sites. There's a lot of misinformation about the way that these whether games are scored and handled. I think some of that misinformation is on the part of the sites who change their rules sometimes fairly often and sometimes do things that aren't explicitly defined in the rules, which we'll talk about in a second. And also the MLB who changes their rules about the way they handle these things, at least recently, somewhat often. Sometimes for COVID-related reasons, we've had some rule changes. But let's kind of talk about this here first of all. So I think this is probably going to be maybe a little bit hard to see. So I will try to zoom us in here. But this is the DraftKings official rulebook for MLB. FanDuel's got one as well. These are the important things to have bookmarked so that you can reference, because these are the rules of the game, right? It's good to know the rules of the game that you're playing, especially when we're staking some money on it. So first things first, canceled games, postponed, rescheduled games, games that completely fail to start will be, they don't count for points, obviously, right? That's pretty straightforward. One thing that is interesting here that we have seen so far, and DraftKings actually does not explicitly name that they will do this, but they use language that essentially says we reserve the right to decide how to handle it. We did have a game earlier this season that was, it was in the main slate. I can't remember who was playing this game. It did not start. It was not the first game on the main slate, and it was postponed after lock. That game's start time was changed by DraftKings, and I think FanDuel may have done it too, to align with the latest starting time for the latest game in the slate, basically allowing players a chance to have a couple extra hours of time to remove those players from their lineups because of that postponement news breaking post-lock. That is not stated explicitly here by DraftKings that they're going to be doing that for every game. At least I read this pretty closely here. I don't believe it is. Again, it kind of, they're basically just saying before a minute to midnight, we'll decide what we're going to do with it. But that is something to be aware of, and we'll talk a little bit more about how we can leverage that strategy in a moment here. But for the most part, right, game gets postponed, it's not going to count. You don't want those players in your lineups. There is a note here also on suspended or shortened games, right? So it says DraftKings uses official MLB statistics, only includes statistics from games MLB deems to be official. If a MLB declares a game suspended, then the statistics generated before the game is suspended will count in game sets containing the game, right? Any statistics generated on a later date when they resume that game will not be included. So let's talk about this a little bit, because this is where the nuance starts to come in. So the most important thing here to note, and I'm going to stick on DraftKings here. FanDuel has pretty much the identical set of rules about how they're going to handle this. So official MLB statistics, and only includes games statistics from games MLB deems to be official. So if you pull up the official MLB glossary here of their definitions, so a regulation game also known as an official game, is one where the visiting team has made 15 outs, so 5 completed innings, and the home team is leading, or once the home team has made 15 outs regardless of score. So you are often going to hear that 5 innings mark, especially in games that have a lot of weather concerns. Games that have weather concerns that are approaching as the game goes on, so where weather's going to hit in the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th inning, you'll see a lot of folks start looking at that 5-inning mark to get to official, because what happens is when you get there, that game is scored and it's official. You won't lose those points for the players at that point, right? If you play a game with weather concerns and it goes 3 innings and the score is 9-8 after 3 innings, and teams have both been hitting all over the place, and your stacks are all going off, but that game ends up getting paused and ultimately stopped at the bottom of the 3rd. That game is not an official game based from the MLB's perspective, and those points can actually be retracted and removed, and those players can be left with zeros if that game gets canceled from that point on. So the 5-inning mark is where the game becomes official. They can keep those scores. They may end up continuing that game on at a later date. That rule has changed here. It doesn't affect DFS dramatically. They will now actually continue that game on. But anyway, that's kind of the main point there, is at that 5-inning mark, you've got an official game, and those players can keep their scores. Of course, obviously, players are going to score a lot more when they get to play 9 innings instead of 5, or what have you. But something to note there. Let's see. There was something else I wanted to mention on this point. Maybe that's it. So a good thing just to be aware of. Obviously, I guess this is the last point. Obviously, when players come back to play again to finish that game, those statistics, the contests have been closed at that point, so they won't be getting additional points down the line. But good place to start with thinking about weather. So the next thing I want to bring up here, I'm going to pull up Slack, make sure we're good. Cool. So the next thing I'm going to pull up here, and you've seen this before, it is the topic message in our MLB channel on Slack. I think Danny posted a screenshot of this morning, but this is Kevin Roth's free weather report on Roto Grinders. This is a free service that Roto Grinders has. It is, I would say, very nearly close to the Bible for DFS weather, really, but particularly baseball, where it's so impactful. This is up pinned or stickied at the top of our baseball channel for a reason. This is the first thing I check every single day when I'm looking at a baseball slate and doing my initial research. And it's one of the last things I check before I put my lineups in for baseball every day. Kevin Roth is also a great follow on Twitter. There are a couple other DFS meteorologists out there that you can find on social media, cast a little bit of a wider net. Mark Paquette is another one that he kind of does some similar stuff as Roth. But this is a great way to just get an idea of what the weather looks like on the slate as a whole right at the start. And he uses this color-coded system here to denote games of what he thinks the relative risk is for the game. So these update typically first thing in the morning. There is one normally in the mid-afternoon. So I think probably around like 3 o'clock Eastern time. A lot of times he'll kind of give an update if there is meaningful updates to give. And then obviously like as lock approaches, he will kind of do one more final update. And as we get very close to lock or post-lock where minutes start to count approaching games, great place to get the most recent updates is following him on Twitter. So anyway, there's a color coding system here. I don't know if he's got it posted what these actually mean here in terms of like quantified percentages of risk. But green, most of the time you're going to be fine. You pretty much can just not even worry about it. Yellow, if I remember correctly, is generally defined as risk of a delay, very outside risk of a postpone, but like probably a very outside risk. Orange is kind of where things start to get very interesting. That's that middle ground where I think it starts to be some potentially likely chance of a delay depending on when weather's going to hit or a notable, I don't know, again, I don't think this is quantified anywhere, a notable, a non-ignorable chance of a postponement. And red is a very likely chance of being delayed mid-game. And you can see it here, a pretty good chance of a PPD. Red are the games where you really start to want to be a little bit concerned. And he'll break these down, like red orange is a slightly higher risk than an orange red, and so on. So first thing to look at the start of my day for baseball, always taking a look at where the games have certain concerns, right? And there are a lot of them tonight. So I would say, as a very general rule of thumb, I trust Roth quite a bit. I think he's pretty accurate. I am very likely to just X games that are red or have any part red, no matter what. I think that those games very likely PPD. A lot of times a game that he marks as red early in the morning end up ultimately getting called even before lock. I am likely to X those out. So we can talk a little bit more about the strategy of not doing that in a minute, but let's say that's what we wanted to do. SaberSim makes that very easy for those of you that don't already know. These little buttons over here with these X or whatever, they're not really X's. Can't remember what this is called, but these little icons here will let you just cross those teams off your list. So if I was just trying to do some initial builds for tonight's slate, we see it is the Washington, the New York Mets, and the Boston games that are all have red. So I would look at just starting to cross these off. So you would do that by just blocking these out. And you can see the players here on the right are going to start disappearing off the list, and they will not be used in lineups, right? So we've done that now for all three of the red games. Where it starts to get interesting is games that are a little bit more on that middle ground of weather concerns. Maybe they have orange mixed in there. And it's good to kind of start to get familiar about what you're expecting for weather concerns in that game, right? A game where it starts dry and rain is coming in heavily as the game goes on has a different risk portfolio than a game that is expecting pop-up thunderstorms, for example, that could happen really at any time, but will also fade quickly, right? So a game that is going to have like a wet, soaking rain, and Roth will, I mean, it's weather. Roth will literally describe this pretty clearly for you. But a game that I don't know if we have a good example here. Let's see. These are the red games, but a game that has like wet soaking rain coming in as the game goes on later may be a game that has some value to playing the starting pitcher who maybe needs like 6 innings to hit value to be a good play, right? A game that has the chance of pop-up thunderstorms and has a higher risk for that is probably very dangerous for a pitcher who, if a thunderstorm starts in the second inning and they end up having to take a 45-minute break, if that pitcher's gotten cold, sometimes the team will just cross him off, bring the bullpen in, and instead of having him warm back up, risk injury. That's pitchers really don't like to do that, right? They don't like to go out, pitch 30 pitches, sit down for an hour, and then warm back up and come out and then start playing professional baseball again. So, but in that case, maybe hitters are not so much at risk in that particular game because, you know, we're not so much concerned about a huge wave of hours of rain coming in and just ending the game. It's more about like lightning concerns and things like that. So again, great place to start. For these games that are yellow-orange, I will sometimes like to get familiar with, and again, especially as it gets closer to lock, with what the actual like weather looks like, what the actual risk portfolio of the weather looks like. So one thing I will note here while we are still on this page, and then we'll start talking a little bit more about what we can do and how we can leverage this in our lineups, is that weather changes quickly, it changes dramatically, and it is very important to be checking this as the day goes on. So this game, this Cubs game, is not on the main slate. This is actually a day game. But this game began as orange-red and would have been a game that we probably just crossed right off the list. Rain didn't come down as hard as expected in Chicago. I could see that also potentially down the line affecting some of these other Midwest games. But this game became yellow, and it actually looks like this game is probably going to play. I don't know if that game has started actually, or if it's still looking as good. But a lot of times you're going to have people that check weather. Actually, let me start here. A lot of people are going to play MLB DFS and not look at weather at all, right? The fishiest of players aren't going to look at this stuff at all. But a lot of players are going to know that weather's important, and they're going to be aware of games getting canceled, and at least take an eye on things when they're building their lineups. But not many of them are going to continue to keep an eye on weather as the day goes on, and especially post-lock as the slate goes on. So there is definitely a lot of times a little bit of advantage in a weather situation that gets better or worse as the day goes on. Weather situations that get better often can be a little under-owned. And weather situations that can get worse can potentially sometimes be a little over-owned, or sometimes people just won't even come check back to see that the weather has gotten much worse in a game situation. I think there's a little bit of bias there too, that people start building lineups with the assumption that even on a assume this was on the main slate, but they start building lineups where this game is X'd. They like the way those lineups look. They spent some time tweaking exposures and getting everything tightened up. And when they find out that they actually can play that game, there's just a lot of people that have like an anchoring bias there to their earlier lineups, and they just keep it X'd because, hey, it could always get postponed. But now the likelihood is that it won't, and you've got some edge by playing that game. But anyway, okay, great. So big overview to weather. Let's hop back onto SaberSim here. Let me check Slat and make sure that I'm talking some kind of sense here. No questions so far, so I will just go ahead and keep rambling. So we have X'd some games that have red weather concerns, right? And let's go ahead and see what kind of lineups we're getting out. So I am going to go ahead and just assume we're playing 20 max. I like these default sliders, and we're going to let it rip here and see what we get out of this. So again, keeping in mind, I don't think this Pittsburgh game is actually on the main slate either. So what we have left is we've got a green-yellow here that, again, as of right now, if it stays at the status, I'm going to just ignore. But we've also got Toronto at Cleveland, which is yellow-orange. Some concerns here. And then a yellow game, Baltimore at White Sox. So while this is building, I will, before we jump into the next segment, to mention I'm not a big cash player. So my focus here when I'm talking about this is going to be for GPPs, and it's going to be very upside focused because that's what it takes to win these contests, right? You're going to see that my personal MLB weather strategy is basically based around maximizing my upside, and also willing to let the floor of my lineups be absolute zero, because that's kind of what we want to build for in GPPs. If you are playing cash games, I would recommend that you up your risk aversion for these rather significantly, right? I still would absolutely X games that are red. I wouldn't even think about it for cash games, right? Red, immediate X. And for games that are orange, especially orange first, there is a slight more risk there. I would really start to consider highly whether or not you want to play those games in your cash game lineups, right? The main reason being that player's floor in an orange game is effectively zero if that game gets postponed. You can often find players, especially hitters, that have median projections that are close enough to the players in the orange games that maybe you sacrifice a little bit of that median outcome, but you don't accept a zero floor for that player. If your pitchers in a cash game lineup gets postponed, it is over. You are almost certainly, unless something surprises the field completely, and it's the chalky cash pitcher somehow gets his game crossed off, you are probably just sunk if you roster a pitcher in particular whose game gets canceled. So anyway, let's take a look over here now. So the games we really want to look at are Toronto and Cleveland. Toronto at Cleveland. So I had mentioned in the Slack today that one way I like to think about this is I am willing to accept stacks, large stacks of either of those teams in those games or the starting pitcher, and unwilling in certain cases to accept one-off plays for those players or smaller stacks. And the reason why is really, again, I'm trying to capitalize on my upside of certain lineups, right? So the upside scenario of the Toronto at Cleveland game, the way I look at it when taking into account risk, is that either of those pitchers have a great game, or that either of those teams as a whole in the form of a large stack have a great game, right? Have an upside ceiling outcome type game. There are a ton of outcomes where a specific player on one of those teams hits a home run and might be a very good one-off, or two of those players hit a home run or something like that and make for a good two stack. But the way I think about it is that the outcome where a 5-man stack of one of those teams is optimal, or 5 of those pieces. I want to explain this in a way that's clear. 5 of those hitters, for example, all have good games, often ends up creating a lineup, a GPP winning lineup where that stack is optimal for that contest, right? An outcome where one of those players hits a home run, or 2 of them, or something like that, does not necessarily create an outcome where in the contest rostering those 2 players is optimal. The upside potential of a lineup that is built with a stack with no weather concerns, for example. So what's a beautiful game? So a Dodgers stack tonight, no weather concerns at all, with a single hitter from Toronto. The outcome of that lineup as it relates to the upside potential of that lineup, from my perspective, is not very well correlated with the overall performance of the single one-off player that's playing in this game. So from a risk standpoint, I will typically just X them out. So hopefully that makes sense. I'm trying to explain that in a as clear as possible, but it's kind of nuanced. So let me know if there are any questions there, but I will talk about what this looks like a little bit in practice. So I will start looking at my stack types. It's a big slate tonight. We've got mostly big full stacks, 5-3, 4-4, 5-2. And I will start looking at specifically what the team stacks I'm looking at are, right? So what I am looking for, and it doesn't look like we're going to have any, but let's artificially find some. So let's do this. Actually, before I go ahead and do that, since I just saw one here, we'll start here, right? So, not show all. Sorry, hold on. My computer is locking up on me a little bit here. Okay, so what I was looking for here is basically any full 4 or 5-man stacks of Toronto or Cleveland, just to get an idea of maybe if SaberSim liked those players. And I don't see any. And secondarily, then what I start looking for is smaller stacks of Toronto or Cleveland, because these are stacks that I'm probably going to be less willing to accept. And I don't see any. So finally, what I will start looking at is one-off batters for those teams. And I did see, oh no, it's just the pitcher. Okay, so I don't see any, but I do see a little bit of Ryu, right? And that basically makes sense with what we're seeing, right? Like SaberSim is thinking that Ryu is actually probably best used as a pitching option, which means we're definitely not going to get a lot of Indians. It looks like no Toronto bats here. So that's kind of what I will start looking for. Again, in an orange game, I'm typically willing to take on some risk of rostering the pitcher. And I'm probably just going to be okay with this, especially our model does take into account weather. Poor weather pitch conditions are typically a little bit more beneficial for pitching. You'll probably see ownership get a little deflated here. I'm willing to take on some risk here. Something to note is, again, always seeing the details of that game in particular. So you can actually even see Roth is saying this is great pitching weather. So something to note here. But he will sometimes specify, like, if this was thunderstorms concerns, he may actually specify like bats maybe look okay here, but pitchers are very much at risk because we can't predict the pop-ups of the thunderstorms at all. So something always to look at there. But let's go ahead and do this real quick, just so we can use it for the purpose of education here. And I'm going to artificially just prop up this game like quite a bit because I want this game to pop really hard. So let's go up to like 5.5 and 4.5 runs and apply the changes here. And then we're going to run another build. Okay, so that went through. Let's run another build here and see what we get. We should probably get quite a few more stacks. Just letting it build here. My computer's been a little slow today, so thank you for being patient with me. All right, let's see. We are probably going to see here. Okay, so that at least had somewhat of the intended outcome here, right? So we at least got some of these stacks now. So let's take a look at this lineup, right, where we did get a Cleveland 4 stack, right? So with 4 batters, we're the outcome of that we're looking at here with this lineup is a situation where the Indians have a pretty good team-wide outcome, right? We're playing 4 pieces of their batting order. It's a significant portion of the lineup. All for this lineup to win. A portion of these players all have a great game, right? They are correlated with each other. We're probably talking about an outcome where Cleveland has a bunch of runs, right? What's the worst case scenario in this game, right? The worst case scenario with this lineup is that this game gets canceled and everyone here scores 0 and the lineup's just sunk. Something very much resembling this game just not even getting played, or this team just having a bad outcome overall, right? Like, we're not overly concerned with the floor of this potential lineup, what the worst case scenario is with this game. But we capture some of the upside that's still there and probably at a reduced ownership, right? Because people are going to shy away from this game. But if we start looking at certain lineups, and what I really want to do is find one where I have a one-off. That would be ideal. Are there any right at the top? Let's see if we can track down a one-off. Do we have any Toronto one-offs? We don't. We don't have any one-off lineups. Let's just find a one-off lineup, and I can use it again to kind of just talk through my thinking. Okay. Wait, let's see. I can do it like this. 5-2. So we have 1-5-2. Okay, so this lineup has a single Dodgers one-off, right? Cody Bellinger. I didn't know he was playing tonight. That's exciting that he's I guess the lineups aren't out yet, but that is exciting news if Bellinger's back. But anyway, right? So let's just say, for example, that the Dodgers had weather concerns tonight. So we look at this lineup and we'll not talk about the pitcher. I'm talking particularly about the one-off here, but let's say the Dodgers had weather concerns, right? And let's consider the upside scenario of this lineup, right? It's a Angel stack with 2 Rangers pieces, and the upside potential of this lineup is the Angels going off. We've got some good pitchers up top, a couple correlated pieces on the Ranger side, and then this one Dodgers piece, right? And he's a good hitter. But he's projected to be pretty low owned. In all normal situations, is probably a good one-off play, right? But the rest of this lineup, for this lineup to do anything, for this lineup to be something we care about at all, the Angel stack needs to go off. We probably need decent performances from the Rangers, and we need decent performances from the pitchers. And a game that has weather concerns, this final piece adds very little upside comparatively compared to the rest of the lineup, and has a 0 floor, right? There are going to be a lot of other players in the pool at outfield that have a similar upside as Cody Bellinger with no floor. This is the kind of lineup that in a weather situation, I don't want to play, assuming that, for example, this was the weather concern game. I want to make that clear, right? This isn't the one, but because we are gaining very little in terms of the relative edge on the field. We gain a little bit from a player that will probably have a little bit depressed ownership, and we're sacrificing a lot where the player could potentially score 0. So that is just the way I like to think about it. Long story short, really what I'm going to do is I will typically accept 4 and 5 stacks, large team stacks of the teams with weather concerns, and I will X out small team stacks. So in this particular case, I'm probably just going to cross this off, right? This is where it starts to get a little bit into a gray area. These 3 players are going to be correlated. They are going to capture some of that like team ceiling outcome, but I will typically X these out. And I will also cross off my one-offs, right? So to be completely honest, we're not very well set up to handle that very well. That process needs to be a little bit more manual, but I can give you some tips. Oh, it looks like we did just get a Toronto stack that popped in there too. So I would also keep this, right? A 5 stack of Toronto. We're just going to let that stay in the pool because it captures the ceiling outcome of that team. So on the one-off thing, we're not super well equipped to handling that, but what I will typically do is once I have removed my small stacks of the teams that I don't want to small stack, I will look at the overall exposure here and just get an idea. So we have 1 Cleveland lineup and 1 Toronto lineup. The easiest way to just see, do I have any one-offs, is to just like look, right? So we have 1 lineup where all these Cleveland players are used. That's that stack, obviously. And we have 1 lineup where the Toronto players are used. That's that 1 lineup. If Bo Bichette was at 10% and said 2 lineups, we would know we had him as a one-off somewhere. We could magnify and filter by Bichette. Oh, what happened? That was weird. Let's see. There we go. We could filter by Bichette, pull up the lineups where he was in, and if we didn't want the lineup where he was a one-off, we could uncheck that box. Another way of doing it would be to cap his exposure. This part is kind of a little manually required, and kind of depends on exactly how you want to handle this too, right? It's not a requirement to go and do this. This is just kind of my personal middle ground of thinking about risk and upside with my GPP lineups, right? So a few other notes here. I want to stay. Let's see. I don't think we've gotten a couple other questions here. We will get to everything. I see a question about MLB Showdown, question about entry editor for Yahoo. We'll get to everything before the end. I'm going to stay on weather for just a couple more minutes while we have the time here. Talk a little bit more about this. So there's been some really great discussion in the Office Hours channel on Slack today so far. So I would check that out and read through this. There are a few different takes from other users about, oh no, excuse me. This is in the MLB channel. I see Samuel Campana mentioned that he will, let's see, so cap some of these orange rated games at 15% of his stacks, sometimes down to 5 to 10% to reduce some additional risk. And said even also, he said, as if you're a risk taker, to even take 3 to 5% chances on some of the red games. That's definitely an option for sure. I don't want to give the impression that what I am demonstrating here is the right way to do it and is the only way to handle weather, right? This is very much an evaluation of your risk versus capturing the upside in those lineups. Weather games are very often going to have depressed ownership, right? They are typically like, I will say Ian Anderson is if the weather situation stays the same as it is, even if the game plays, right? If it ends up they just play in rain, or if the weather situation suddenly gets better, he's not going to be this highly owned. And you have opportunities to get much higher relative value on the field by rostering some of these plays with weather concerns. So I will say one of the last things that I want to talk about here, and I didn't talk about it early, so I will do so now. Let me reset these projections. Is with red games, I think you are probably still best crossing them off. But let's say for the sake of example here that these games were all orange. And these slates can be really hard when you start getting into some of the slates where you have many different games that are all orange and require some thinking about how exposed you want to be to them. It is a very good idea, too, to get familiar with what SaberSim's stance is on those games overall. And we can see some of this with the totals, right? Totals under 4, you're going to see pitchers probably pop. Totals over 5 or even just 4.5 or higher, you're going to start to see some hitters pop. So it's a good idea to think about, like, what am I sacrificing by crossing this game off if there was no weather risk. So you can do that too by just running another test build. And like, let's get an idea of what we're seeing in the 3 weather games or 4 weather games and see what we would potentially sacrifice by giving those games up. And again, in this case, right, red, I'm very unlikely to play any of these 3 games if nothing changes here. But if they were orange, I would want to make some risk valuations. So let's take a look here. Okay. So yeah, you can see here, right? So let's look at our pitchers first. So we are seeing, we have pitchers on both sides of this Mets and Braves game. SaberSim really likes Ian Anderson tonight. Makes sense against the Mets. Probably would like him even more because I think this is already factoring in ownership. He's projected to be highly owned and he probably won't be. And that looks like it for pitchers. Let's look at stacks and see. We have a handful of Milwaukee stacks, right, at Washington. Good hitters park. Makes sense to me. We actually are getting some Miami stacks. That's pretty interesting. I don't remember what we had their total at. And then a 4-piece Boston stack. Some smaller Brewer stacks, some Washington stacks, right? We actually are getting some pretty decent exposure to some of these games here. So it doesn't look like we're too overly exposed to one team. But if you are willing, this is a situation, again, let's assume these games were orange. This is something where you want to think about like the way your potential risk to these games. And I would probably say, we've looked at this. Oh, I think I got some of these teams mixed up. Miami's playing at Boston, right? Okay. So we have some idea here that like we kind of like hitters here. And we kind of like hitters here. And if and we like pitchers in this game, and if the weather prospect of these games got better, it's maybe a situation where you want to start allowing some exposure to these, right? I would say even if they were orange, I would still go in and probably remove some of the smaller piece stacks. So I would probably start doing stuff like this and just crossing some of these off just because I want to play for the outcome where the 5-man stack of this team is optimal, right? You've got to have them and they're at low ownership. And that's kind of my outcome I'm looking at. And maybe also, again, assuming that these games are actually a little more playable than red because they're not very playable at the moment, maybe like capping some of these pitchers at a little bit and reducing my risk to these somewhat. But yeah, it's a good idea. The larger point here is when you're thinking about weather, especially early on in the day, just to get an idea, doing some of your initial test builds, just see what what you are sacrificing and what is going away with those games when they either get postponed or if you cross them off your list. So just something to note, keeping an eye on as we go through, right? By default, again, this is just default SaberSim with the settings I've been using. We kind of like Ryu here in this Toronto game. We definitely like a little bit of bats in the Brewers and Nationals game and the Marlins and Sox game, which makes sense with those parks. And the we like some pitchers in this game. So something to just note, especially as weather changes throughout the day. So